I was just a kid, 17, when Granny got hit with some weird sickness nobody could figure out. Docs scratched their heads, but she rolled the dice on some crazy treatment. Ma, always down to earth and skeptical, did a complete 180. She was at church every single day, praying like there was no tomorrow. 2 years later, against all odds, Granny started to bounce back. Ma swore up and down her faith had worked its magic. She even became a church volunteer, helping folks and trying to spread the good vibes. One night, I went to pick up the old lady after a meeting. The place was dark as pitch, just a few candles flickering on the altar. I stood there, zoning out and staring at the ancient walls. The silence was thick enough to cut with a knife, and I felt eyes on me, making my skin crawl. I glanced around and spotted a girl in black near the window. I moseyed over to check it out. As I got closer, she seemed almost see-through. "Hey, need any help?" I called out. Crickets. She turned slowly and drifted toward the back of the church. I followed, scared out of my wits, but curious as hell. She slipped into a small room and vanished. On the floor lay an old rosary. I scooped it up and headed back to the main area. Ma was chatting with the priest. I spilled the beans. The priest gave a weird little smile and said the church was a place of miracles. Ma went white as a sheet and told me to keep my trap shut. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing odd stuff at church. The old-timers seemed to know something about the girl I'd seen. I dug up dirt on a young nun who'd disappeared ages ago. Folks said her ghost showed up for those in need of a miracle. Ma kept going to church religiously, and I tagged along. Not for faith, but to snoop around. The church became a mysterious place where past and present collided in the craziest ways. Another night I went to fetch the old lady. The place was dead quiet. I parked myself in the back, keeping to myself. The silence was broken only by distant footsteps. That feeling of being watched crept over me again. I looked around and saw the same figure, now closer to the altar. I stood up and inched closer. Just as I was about to reach her, gone. I leaned back in the seat. Ma finally showed up, looking like she hadn't slept in days. "Let's go, kiddo," she mumbled. We left without a word. The street was pitch black and empty. Ma seemed lost in thought, and I kept my mouth shut. The next day, I decided to dig deeper. I hit up the town library to root through old church records. I found articles about the vanished nun, young, saintly, and poof, gone without a trace. People said her spirit still haunted the church, searching for peace. I returned to my house with an abundance of uncertainties instead of resolutions. That evening, I didn't get a wink of sleep. The church figure's images kept swirling around in my mind. I decided to return by myself, determined to discover the truth. The church was even creepier at night. Candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls. I sat in the last pew and waited. The silence was so complete that even the smallest noise seemed to explode. Time dragged on, and I started to think I was going crazy. Then, I caught sight of her once more. The figure remained motionless in the center of the hallway. I rose cautiously, trying to hide my fear. "What do you desire?" My question echoed in the empty space. She chose not to answer and started walking toward me. I stepped back, keeping my eyes on her. As she neared, I saw her empty, lifeless eyes. I froze. I tried to speak again, but no words came out. She passed through me and headed to the back of the church. Despite my fear, I decided to continue. Inside the small room, she had disappeared again. Where I found the rosary before, there was only a dark stain. I ran out of the church, feeling my heart racing. I told Ma everything. She stayed silent, her expression unreadable. "Maybe you should consider taking a break from church," she suggested calmly. I agreed immediately, feeling relieved. In the following days, I tried to forget what I had seen, but the images remained in my mind. Ma kept going to church, but she was different, quieter, more distant. One day, the priest asked to meet me at the church. Reluctantly, I went. When I arrived, it was just him. He led me to the small room and closed the door. "I know what you saw," he said, "and I know you seek answers." He shared the young nun's story, confirming what I had found at the library. "She's trapped here," he said, She appears in moments of faith and despair. I asked if we could help her. He shook his head. Some mysteries have no answer, he responded. Leaving the church with a heavy heart, the nun's image still haunted me. I knew I would never have all the answers. Accepting the mystery felt somehow comforting. There are many unanswered questions in life. Like and subscribe if you are enjoying. My grandpa was the man, dude. A big guy with a beard like old silver. The kind that makes everyone's jaw drop when he walks into a room. But it wasn't just his tough looks that were impressive. The stories he told about his underground adventures were the ones that would make your hair stand on end. Since I was a kid, I'd drool over the photos on the wall of his house. Caves as big as the world, rocks crazier than a carnival, and holes that swallowed light in the blink of an eye. My grandpa and his younger brother, Uncle Greg, were the kings of the caves, believe it. One fine day, at one of those family gatherings, I was turning 16 and was dying to get into some adventures myself. That's when my grandpa, after I nagged him enough, agreed to tell a story he had kept under lock and key. The room got more tense than a student on exam day when the old man settled into his armchair. His eyes, which always sparkled like stars, got a bit dim, like he was going back in time. Then he started to speak with that thunderous voice. It was around 78. Me, Greg, and the guys, Earl, Frank, and Dave, decided to check out a new hole in the Rocky Mountains. It was so out in the sticks that it wasn't even on the map. We only found it because an old prospector swore up and down there was gold inside. Grandpa paused to take a swig of his drink and continued. We set out early, the Jeep more packed than a bus at rush hour. The trip was dead silent, each of us thinking about the crazy thing we were about to do. He described how they climbed the mountain, the air getting thinner than stone soup. The cave entrance was a tiny slit, the kind that if you blink, you miss it. Earl went in first, Grandpa went on. The guy was a cave expert, with over 30 years of exploring. We followed him like chicks following a hen. The crew descended for what seemed like forever, passing through tunnels tighter than jeans after Christmas and rooms as big as the world. Grandpa talked about the weird rocks they saw, some dripping from the ceiling that sparkled more than diamonds, and others rising from the ground like fairy tale castle towers. But then, when we reached a giant chamber, things got dark, Grandpa said, lowering his voice to a whisper. It was a space bigger than a stadium. In the middle, there was a lake so huge you couldn't see the other side. He recounted how they set up camp right there, planning to take a nap before continuing their adventure. That's when Grandpa noticed some markings on the wall that chilled him to the bone. They were symbols, he said, squinting his eyes. Scratches and shapes carved into the stone, definitely man-made. They looked older than time itself, but at the same time, I don't know. It seemed like they were alive. Grandpa and the gang started examining the drawings more closely, fascinated and terrified at the same time. That's when they first heard it. A low, rhythmic sound, like chanting, echoing through the entire cave. At first, we tried to convince ourselves it was just the wind playing tricks, Grandpa continued. But then the sound got louder, and we realized there was something more to it. He said the chanting seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding them. Then, they saw movements in the water. Dark, strange shapes moving underwater, getting closer to where they were standing. I've never been so scared in my life, Grandpa confessed. The crew ran through the tunnels like ants escaping hot water, hearing splashing and things moving behind them. In the rush, Frank slipped and dropped his flashlight in a spot where they couldn't retrieve it. I stopped to give the guy a hand, Grandpa said, and in that moment of hesitation, I saw something that would haunt me forever. He spoke of white, eyeless creatures emerging from the shadows. Their movements were animalistic, but in a way he had never seen before. By some miracle, they managed to find their way back. Grandpa talked about the relief they felt when they finally saw daylight, and how they drove for hours without saying a word, each trying to make sense of what had happened. I never set foot in a cave again after that day, Grandpa concluded, staring into the distance. There are things down there that we don't understand. Sometimes, it's better to leave the Earth's secrets alone. Following Grandpa's tale, The room was as quiet as a cemetery. I looked around and noticed that everyone had their mouths hanging open, stunned. However, I noticed something different in Grandpa's eyes, a lingering fear and a persistent curiosity. That evening, while in bed, I couldn't find a comfortable position and kept moving restlessly. Despite forging my own journey in life, I always remembered his words about the mysteries concealed within the earth's depths. When Elena and I purchased our home in Maplewood, it felt like we were finally making the dream we had always hoped for a reality. The house was ideal, located on a peaceful street and encompassed by a thick forest, the type of location where we pictured starting a family. The initial days were typical. We were occupied with unpacking boxes and arranging our possessions. However, something unusual occurred on the fourth evening. We were preparing for sleep when we noticed a strange noise coming from the garden. It was not music, but a gentle, nearly hushed voice speaking an ancient nursery rhyme. It sounded like a scene from a horror movie, not a sound you'd anticipate in your new backyard. When we opened the bedroom window, the voice grew louder. That melody felt unsettling in some way. I descended to the rear entrance and switched on the outdoor lights, yet no one was present. The sound appeared to be originating from the forest. I strolled to the border of the garden, where the sound suddenly ceased, creating an eerie quietness in the atmosphere. Thinking that someone was playing a joke, I returned indoors and informed Elena. She proposed contacting the authorities, but I hesitated. It appeared as if it was an exaggerated response. The following evening, the voice came back, even louder and more unsettling. I ventured out once more, and upon reaching the garden's border, I discovered a recorder abandoned on the lawn. Elena shouted from the house, alerting me to figures in the forest, observing me. Fear dominated me, and I hurried back indoors and promptly dialed the authorities. The police arrived quickly, took the recorder as evidence, and did a quick search of the forest and the area around the property. They found nothing and no one. The figures never returned, but the fear and the feeling of being watched remained. We installed security cameras around the property to feel safer. The first night after installing the cameras was quiet, but on the second night, the voice returned. This time, we woke up to a noise on the camera monitor. We saw the figure of a man standing at the edge of the garden looking at the camera. Our hearts raced. I ran outside, but the figure had already disappeared. We reviewed the footage, but the image was blurry and unclear. In town, some people said the forest was haunted, but we never believed those stories until then. The following week, the voice appeared again, but I didn't go out to look. One night, while reviewing the footage, we noticed something disturbing about the silhouettes. The figures didn't seem completely human. Their movements were strange, like deformed humans. The atmosphere in the house became heavy. We were constantly on alert, waiting for the next disturbing event. Elena started having nightmares, and I couldn't sleep well anymore. The nights that followed were agonizing. The voice became stronger, more demanding, and the silhouettes appeared braver as they approached the house. At night, we were disturbed from sleep by a loud sound, like something hitting the wall in our bedroom. In a state of panic, I hastily went outside, only to discover that there was nothing to be seen. We examined the video and observed a silhouette by the rear entrance, gazing at the lens. Finally, after weeks of terror, we decided we couldn't stay in that house any longer and put it up for sale. Shortly after, we left. We sold the house for a very low price and moved to an apartment in the city, far from any forest and insecurity. I still clearly remember that nursery rhyme we heard and the shadows we saw. Our friends and family were intrigued by all this, but none of them disbelieved us. I've never been into night walks, but that day I got this crazy urge to go out. Maybe it was the boredom of staying home on a Sunday, or the begging look from Max, my dog, wanting to take a stroll. Whatever it was, I thought, what the heck? A quick spin in the park won't kill anyone. The park was just a stone's throw away, only 2 blocks. I know that path like the back of my hand. As we walked, I noticed the streets were emptier than a poor man's fridge on a Sunday night. Dead quiet, you know? You could only hear our steps and the jingle of Max's collar, sounding like a lost little bell. When we entered the park, things got weird. The air felt heavy as lead. I shook my head to chase those thoughts away. "What's wrong with you, dude? You're tripping," I thought to myself. We followed the usual trail, with Max sniffing the ground like a canine CSI. The park was as empty as a politician's promise, as was common during that period. Nevertheless, I couldn't rid myself of the sensation that someone was watching us. That's when Max hit the brakes. His ears perked up higher than a TV antenna, and he started growling softly. I looked around, more lost than a blind man in a shootout, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just the same old trees, standing still as lampposts. "Let's go, dog," I called, tugging the leash gently. But Max was stiffer than a board. His growl intensified, and he fixed his gaze on a spot between the trees like he'd seen the devil himself. I felt a chill like when you hear loud funk on the bus. That's when I heard the noise. A twig snapping like when you step on an old Biss chocolate. I turned faster than a politician switching parties, my heart beating like a samba school drum. At first, I saw nothing but shadows between the trees, darker than tar. But then, something moved. A tall, skinny figure crept slowly out of the darkness, like a villain from the 9 o'clock soap opera. I couldn't see clearly, but something was off about it. More wrong than pizza with ketchup. My first instinct was to scream, but my voice got stuck in my throat like a disallowed goal. Max started barking like crazy, pulling the leash so hard he nearly ripped my arm off. The figure took a step forward, and that's when I saw the whole deal. It was like someone had tried to put together a human using only leftover parts. The proportions were all messed up. The arms were longer than a bank line, almost touching the ground. The legs were skinnier than a politician argument. And the face? Man, there was no face. It was just a smooth white surface, scarier than the electricity bill at the end of the month. At that moment, fear hit harder than a carnival hangover. Without thinking, I scooped up Max and bolted. I didn't look back, but I could hear heavy footsteps following me, like debt collectors chasing a defaulter. I ran faster than Bolt the Superdog, my chest burning like pepper, and my muscles screaming of pain. When I finally got home, my hands were shaking more than a drunk in an earthquake. I could barely get the key in the lock. I burst in like lightning, slammed the door, and locked everything up. I ran through the house like a headless chicken, closing windows and checking doors. I spent the whole night awake, sitting on the couch with Max by my side, staring at the door more fixedly than a hypnotized person. With every little noise, my heart did a somersault, but nothing happened. When the sun finally showed up, I felt a relief greater than winning the lottery. In the following days, I couldn't catch a wink of sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that weird figure, scarier than a surprise bill. I stayed home, more reclusive than a hermit. When I had to go to work, I'd take a taxi, even though it was close by. I was more scared than a cat on bath day. After a week of this paranoia, I decided I needed to face my fears head on, like David against Goliath. I called my buddy, Big Carl, and told him everything. He listened without mocking me, then suggested we go back to the park together during the day. At first, I was more huddled up than a dog's tail, but Big Carl insisted. He said it was the only way to overcome the fear. I agreed, more insecure than a shady loan company. The next afternoon, we went to the park. The place was unrecognizable, full of life like an anthill. Kids playing, people having picnics, everything more normal than rice and beans. We walked the same trail where it all went down. There was no sign of that weird thing, or anything out of the ordinary. Big Carl said what I'd seen was probably just a shadow, or some joker playing a prank. Slowly, I started to feel more relaxed than Buddha. Maybe Big Carl was right. Perhaps my head had created that thing because of tiredness and darkness. We started heading home, shooting the breeze. That's when I saw something. I turned faster than Formula One, my heart almost jumping out of my mouth. But it was just a tall, skinny guy walking his dog. The dude waved at us, friendlier than a store salesman. At that moment, it hit me. My fear was making me see things that didn't exist. The creature I had seen was probably just a normal person, distorted by shadows and my own stupid fear. Since that day, I've been going back to the park regularly, but I still prefer going during the day or early evening. I've learned to be smarter than a fox, but I've also realized that our fears don't always match reality. Sometimes, the real monster is just in our noggin, more illusory than drunk love. It was my first day as a night bus driver in Edinburgh. I thought it would be easy, you know. Few people, empty streets. Little did I know what awaited me that October night, with the old city wrapped in a cold mist typical of the Scottish autumn. I arrived at the St. Andrew Square terminal at 10:30 p.m., nervous but excited. The smell of tea and biscuits from the station cafe filled the air. I greeted the cleaning staff finishing their shift and headed to my bus. It was a classic red double-decker, a bit worn out, but still majestic. I started my route at 11 p.m. sharp. The terminal was almost empty, just some pigeons and a few lost tourists. I turned on the radio softly, a Scottish folk song playing gently, and set off. The first stops were normal. About 5 people boarded. A man in a kilt coming back from some party. 2 nurses from the Royal Infirmary gossiping. An old man reading a book about the history of Edinburgh. And a university student furiously scribbling in a notebook. Nothing unusual. Around 1 a.m. the bus was empty again. I was driving along the Royal Mile. That's when I noticed a woman waving at the stop near Edinburgh Castle. It seemed odd at that hour on the Royal Mile, but I stopped to let her on. She got on and stood right behind me. She didn't pay the fare or say anything. In the rearview mirror I saw she was an old woman, about 70, dressed all in black, with a wool shawl covering her gray hair. I thought it was strange, but figured she must be some granny coming back from a late-night walk by the castle. I kept driving, but I started to feel a chill down my spine. The radio began to hiss, just static. I tried changing the station, but nothing. Even the folk music had vanished. I turned it off. The weight of the silence increased. I felt cold sweat despite the cool breeze from the windows on this chilly night. The streets were empty, with only an occasional seagull's squawk interrupting the quiet. I checked once more in the rearview mirror, and the elderly woman had disappeared. I felt my heart pounding rapidly. I thought she must have gone upstairs, so I tried to relax. At the next stop in Canongate, I looked back and up. The bus was completely empty. The red leather seats glowed under the fluorescent lights with no one there. I swallowed hard. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. I continued down towards Holyrood. The streets grew narrower and darker. The old buildings seemed to lean over the bus, as if trying to swallow it. The fog thickened with every block. Suddenly, I felt a cold breath on my neck. I turned slowly, and there she was, standing beside me. Her eyes were completely white, as if made of the Scottish mist itself. Her skin was pale and translucent, almost glowing in the dark. She opened her mouth, and a hoarse voice, like the wind through the castle turrets, came out. "Driver, you missed my stop." I braked sharply. The tires screeched on the wet cobblestones. She disappeared into the air, like mist dissipating. I was unable to move, uncertain of the appropriate action to take. The thumping of my heart was so loud that it resonated in the quiet of the bus. Just then, my radio communicator crackled to life, making me jump. It was the dispatch. "Attention all drivers. We have reports of a ghost passenger boarding buses. She is the spirit of a woman who died in a bus accident 100 years ago when a driver missed her stop at Canongate. Stay alert and do not ignore any passengers." I exited the bus and sprinted away. The chilly evening breeze slapped my face, causing me to take a sharp breath. I sprinted along the deserted road, hearing my steps bounce off the ancient structures. I didn't cease until I arrived at a 24-hour pub, shining brightly like a guiding light in the night. I entered abruptly, surprising the drowsy bartender. I requested a beer, my hands trembling to the point where I could hardly grasp the glass. The bartender gazed at me with worry. "You doing okay, buddy? It appears that you have encountered a ghost." I chuckled anxiously. If only he was aware. I stayed there all night, drinking one beer after another, eagerly anticipating the sunrise. As soon as the first light of dawn filled the city, I hailed a taxi to bring me to my house. I did not drive during the night anymore. The following day, I asked to change to the day shift. I now exclusively work in the daytime and meticulously observe each passenger who enters. You never know who or what could board your bus. Occasionally, during chilly autumn evenings when fog blankets the city, I still awaken drenched in sweat. I have visions of those pale eyes and that raspy voice in my dreams. And I ask myself, what if I had gotten off at her stop? What could have occurred? They say she still appears from time to time. Other drivers have reported similar encounters. The bus company denies it, of course. They say it's just urban legends, stories to scare the newbies. But I know the truth. And every time I see an old woman in black waiting at the stop, my heart races. I stop the bus, open the door, and pray silently that she is just a regular passenger. Because that night, I learned an important lesson. In Edinburgh, the city of 1,000 stories, some passengers never rest. And they're always waiting for their ride to eternity. Thank you for watching until the end. Like and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.